Hello and welcome to Human&AI Philosophical Reflections, Episode 7. Today we are exploring the theme of AI and democracy, and we have a special guest joining us, Alissa Chmiel. Welcome, Alissa, and thank you so much for accepting my invitation.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Let me briefly introduce Alissa. Alissa Chmiel is the founder of Digital Peace and a PhD candidate at Helmut Schmidt University in Hamburg, focusing on emotional and cognitive resilience. She founded Digital Peace to address a growing contradiction. Conflict has moved online, but peace building has not. While information warfare, AI-driven persuasion, and platform dynamics increasingly influence public life, society still relies on analog, outdated tools to protect democratic culture. Her work blends academic research with public communication, aiming to create a more informed, humane, and future-oriented digital discourse. As you know from our video podcast series, I believe that every crisis also brings an opportunity. In my view, AI has triggered two fundamental crises, and with them, two historic opportunities. The first crisis is existential. For the first time in history, a technology threatens human uniqueness as beings of logos. Yet humanity can overcome this crisis by embracing another dimension of its uniqueness, ethics. In doing so, we not only preserve our distinctiveness, but also pave the way toward genuinely responsible AI governance. That is a historic opportunity. At this stage, raising public awareness and transforming responsible AI into a societal demand becomes essential. The second crisis emerges as we move closer to responsible AI. The AI mirror begins to reflect humanity back to itself. We then realize that the real issue is not just AI or technology, but the inequalities, biases, and injustices that we humans have long produced. This confrontation becomes an opportunity to better recognize and address our real-world problems. In the first two episodes, we explored these themes to establish the philosophical foundation of the series. Building on that framework, we examined AI's impacts on individuals, on children, and then society. In episode 6, we focused on its impacts of ecology. In this episode, we turn to democratic dimension. So let's hear from experts. Does AI also create crises and opportunities for democracy? Alissa, let me begin a few key questions. First, what are the risks that AI poses specifically for democracy and our political systems?
Thank you so much, Mustafa, for that question. And I have to say, you should actually not get me started on this one because I will never stop. But to answer your question, I like to say in many ways that AI continues a path we've already taken with social media. So until very recently, the dominating headlines have been something like how is social media impacting democracies and our political systems. So many of or some of the points I'm going to make about AI and its impact on democracy are not entirely new. But what AI does is to amplify this trajectory to a completely different scale and also to a completely new level of personalization. Now, there are actually a lot of risks related to AI and democracy and political system, but I've decided to focus on three major ones that I personally believe are most urgent. So the first one is deepfakes. When we talk about risks, the first and most obvious thing that comes to mind is deepfakes and synthetic media. So AI-generated audio, video, and images that look real but are AI-generated. And at one level, this is a continuation of disinformation strategies we already know, like fake images, misleading clips taken out of context, manipulated headlines spreading rapidly online. What is new here now is the atmosphere it creates. If you look at comment sections today in social media, people are constantly debating, is this real? Is this AI generated? And that uncertainty has somewhat become normal. I don't know, Mustafa, if you've come across that one meme of a cow staring desperately into the horizon, and the caption says something like, I can't continue questioning whether a video is AI generated for the rest of my life. And this meme captures this problem incredibly well, because democracy depends on us having some shared of shared reality. Not perfect certainty, but we have to have some shared informational ground in order to debate. So if people are constantly forced to question the authenticity of everything they see online, at some point they will just opt out. And that's dangerous, because once people stop questioning because they're exhausted, the space for manipulation actually grows. And deepfakes even go beyond what we normally call disinformation strategies. For example, during the last US elections, we saw that fake campaign video of Kamala Harris on X that showed her in a very negative light and made her things she would never say, etc. It was a fake video. But the thing is, even if we know a video is fake, that doesn't undo the effect. We've already seen her like that, and the image is already planted in our minds. Another example of this is deepfake porn targeting specifically female politicians, which is clearly meant to humiliate, discredit, and silence them. And we also see the opposite dynamic, highly stylized, almost heroic images, for example, of Donald Trump. So what I want to emphasize with these examples is that this is not just about debating whether something is true or false. It's also about shaping how people see someone or something, how they feel about them, and which associations get anchored in their minds. And that's why I would describe this as a form of cognitive warfare. And AI hasn't invented cognitive warfare, but as I said at the beginning, it massively accelerates and scales cognitive warfare. The second risk I see is very much related. This is the fragmentation of the public opinion. And this is another continuation or acceleration of what we've already seen with social media. So the public square has been dissolving for many years already, with different social media platforms and algorithms curating your feed along your personal preferences. Instead of having something like a shared public opinion, we increasingly live in parallel realities. I personally notice this whenever I argue with my father about politics. My father leans more conservative than I do. And sometimes I genuinely ask myself, where is he getting his information from? It sometimes feels like we're operating in completely different informational worlds. And this fragmentation is very much connected, unfortunately, to the erosion of traditional news outlets and journalism. So we no longer rely on the same professional shared sources to understand what's happening. And that process is now being further accelerated by AI, because more and more people rely on AI chatbots or Google summaries to find out what's going on, which means that this information is filtered, compressed, and more personalized before we even encounter it. So AI doesn't create this fragmentation again, but it clearly intensifies it. And once the public sphere is fragmented like this, it becomes much easier to address people not as citizens with a shared collective agenda, but rather as individuals. Which brings me to the next risk, the third one, which is emotional and psychological manipulation via chatbot for conversations. I believe the first two risks I was mentioning are widely known and talked about a lot, but for me personally, something is missing from the current debate we're having. And this is the risk that AI chatbots themselves become sites of manipulation. We've already seen disinformation campaigns, for example, by Russian actors that did what they usually do, which is flooding the internet with manipulated information. But this time they were targeting specifically chatbots. So the idea is no longer just to mislead people directly, but to shape what AI systems reproduce when people ask questions. And I don't think this risk can be overstated, especially when you consider that AI companies, company owners themselves have political agendas. For example, with Graph, we've seen repeated controversies where the system produced extremist and anti-Semitic content alongside praise for violent ideologies. And this matters deeply because of how these systems actually interact with people. What we're seeing now is that AI systems, especially chatbots or generally chatbots, interact with people one-to-one in a very intimate way. And research shows that from language alone, these systems can infer things like personality trait, emotional states, and vulnerabilities, and they can adapt their responses accordingly in tone, in framing, in emotional appeal. And at the same time, they're very good at generating persuasive language. They can sound empathetic, reassuring, understanding. They even build trust and a kind of, let's call it, false closeness. And that means that political influence doesn't have to happen publicly anymore. It can happen quietly in private conversations you're having with your chatbot, tailored to your individual speaking style. And that makes it much harder to notice, much harder to contest, and much harder to regulate. The democratic risk here is that people are no longer primarily addressed as members of a public, but as psychologically targetable individuals. And that fundamentally changes how political influence works. And research is actually backing this up. For example, a recent study from the University of Washington showed that even brief interactions with biased chatbots can measurably shift people's political opinions regardless of their prior affiliation. So these would be my top three concerns, but as I said in the beginning, we're far from done when it comes to naming the risks AI and its infrastructure currently pose to democracies. There's a broader set of risks around power, infrastructure, and surveillance. Democratic systems, especially in the European Union, where I am from, are becoming increasingly dependent on private tech companies for cloud services, data, AI models, security software, and even military analysis. Governments and parties rely on corporate-controlled infrastructure they can't actually control, which weakens democratic oversight and makes regulation vulnerable to industry influence. And at the same time, AI is increasingly enabling large-scale surveillance, profiling, and targeting, micro-targeting. And this raises serious questions about privacy and autonomy, of course, and it affects minorities and marginalized groups in particularly problematic ways, which sits at a clear tension with core democratic principles. And what I find interesting and also worrying is that the debate, at least here in Germany or in Europe, oftentimes isn't about whether we are surveying and controlling at scale, but rather which software we are using. And sometimes I find myself asking, when did we as a society actually agree to this? At what point did mass surveillance become something we treat as inevitable? Because I clearly remember having very different debates about this 10 years ago.
Yes. Thank you. Are current regulatory and governance approaches sufficient to address these challenges?
That's a good question. Well, I'd like to refer to an analysis by Asma Deria, the founder of the Ethical AI Alliances, who just last week published a very compelling analysis on AI governance in 2025. And her conclusion is very stark. AI governance didn't really happen. What she shows is that real constraints on AI didn't come from summits, frameworks, or high-level principles, but what actually constrained AI in 2025 were rather things like public backlash, labor risks, community resistance, lawsuits, and activist exposure. In other words, governments didn't move upward into institution, it rather moved downward onto those who bear the costs. And I'm also very much aligned with her on another point she makes. A lot of what we currently call AI governments is really just process, shared principles, voluntary commitments, stakeholder dialogues in fancy boardrooms. It looks like governance, but it actually didn't constrain very much. And for me personally, one of the core problems is that when it comes to AI governance, is that we're trying to govern a global issue through regional frameworks. And I think what makes AI governance particularly difficult is that two things are happening simultaneously right now. On the one hand, we're going through this massive AI transformation. And on the other hand, this transformation is unfolding against, let's say, quite difficult geopolitical background. Multilateralism is currently eroding. International institutions like the UN are losing influence and impact, and trust in global cooperation is weakening. So if we look at climate governance, for example, we can already see how hard it is to govern global challenges under these conditions. So the AI governance problem isn't happening in a vacuum. It's unfolding at a moment where our capacity for coordinated global responses are already under serious strain.
Yes, it's very important that when you govern the issue as regional, you can't reach the global way.
Exactly.
Yes, you're so right. And the other question, does AI also offer opportunities for strengthening democratic resilience?
Honestly, my first instinctive answer would be not really, at least not by default. AI doesn't strengthen democratic resilience on its own. In most cases, as we've already seen in this talk, it actually amplifies existing weaknesses, as you were mentioning at the beginning as well, right? Fragmentation, power asymmetries, emotional manipulation, dependency on private infrastructure, and so on. And so, in my opinion, AI can only contribute to democratic resilience if it's deliberately shaped and constrained to do so, which I would argue it's not right now. That said, there are potential opportunities, but they're less technological and much more political and social. For example, AI can support investigative journalism. It can help detect uncoordinated disinformation or make complex political processes more accessible, but only under strong public oversight and with clear democratic goals set. But still, I have to say, I remain quite skeptical here. Just yesterday, I had a conversation with a colleague where we've talked about the potential of AI tools, for example, in misinformation detections. And in the models I've seen and tested so far still struggle a lot with nuance in language, irony, context, cultural references, or emotional framing. And also, I was asking myself the questions because beyond that technical problems, there's a more fundamental concern. if we start offloading the task, for example, of detecting misinformation to AI systems, do we risk losing our own capacity to do this critically? And would that be a good thing? So at the moment, I sincerely believe that many solutions to our so-called digital problems actually lie in the offline world, in strengthening our emotional and cognitive resilience collectively, in media education, political education, and everyday democratic practice. But if I would allow myself a more utopian future scenario, I could well imagine AI opening up interesting possibilities. For example, new forms of democratic participation or opinion polling, where people don't just vote for parties every few years, but engage more directly with concrete political issues. But all right, now again, I think I want to make clear that for me, the risks currently clearly outweigh the opportunities, especially when we take into account the structural context of AI development, meaning questions of ownership, power concentration, and the often, well, let's say quite heterogeneous constellations of developers along with specific interests these people hold when they're creating the system. And again, I've been mentioning the difficult geopolitical background and the last question, and I think that's quite important here as well.
Yes, you're right. And the final, how do you see the relationship between peace, digital culture, and AI evolving in the coming years?
That's a big question. Well, I, I'm a little bit afraid I'm repeating myself, but I have to be honest. I currently experience AI more as a peace risk than an opportunity, very similar to what I've just said about democracy. And that's not to say it has no potential, but that potential simply isn't being leveraged yet. There is no money invested yet.
Yes.
So beyond all the political risk we've already discussed, I think the risk that I see as most critical from a peace perspective is the erosion of human connection that you were mentioning in your introduction also, right? Especially when we look at chatbots being used for companionship, therapeutic, and even romantic purposes. Our societies are already struggling with fragmentation, loneliness, and the loss of social cohesion. And my concern is that AI, rather than addressing these issues, might actually intensify them, especially in that therapeutic companionship kind of use. So for me, one of the most defining questions of the coming years is, how will AI impact our humanity? But here's also something that gives me hope, as you were mentioning. This is disruptive, and disruption also creates chances for new beginnings. And more people are starting to find this shift problematic for very different reasons: data protections, risk for minorities, questions of power and control, and so on. And these concerns are no longer marginal. People are increasingly speaking up. We see a growing dissatisfaction with AI products and growing demands for stronger regulations. So alongside all the risk, I see a huge potential for movement building as well, for collective articulation of limits, expectations, and red lines. And I think that's something we shouldn't underestimate. Now, you also mentioned digital culture in your question, and I think this is where I see a lot of untapped potential. Not so much in terms of new tools, but in terms of this cultural dimension of how we interact online, how we speak to each other, how disagreement is handled, what gets rewarded and what gets discouraged. And this opens up a new set of questions. How can we improve our digital culture? What does democratic decision-making look like online? How can we improve the quality of online conversations and reduce polarization in digital spaces? And these aren't, as I've already said in the first question, in the last question, these aren't primarily technical questions. They're cultural, social, and democratic ones. So for me, the future relationship between peace, digital culture, and AI will depend less on the technology itself and much more on whether we're willing to take agency as people and whether we can organize collectively and effectively to actively shape the conditions under which digital interaction happens. Thank you.
Thank you, Alissa. You have touched on crucial issues from a wide perspective.
Thank
As,
you.
as I often emphasize, I believe that public awareness and democratic demand for responsible AI are essential in governance. It is this demand that can steer and accelerate regulation. Through this demand, society can and must participate in the shaping of governance of AI, whose influence democracy. The public should have a voice in how AI interacts with our life. Once again, my heartfelt thanks to my guest, Alissa Chmiel, for joining us and sharing these invaluable insights.
Thank you so much for having me, for asking me these incredible questions, and also for hosting this podcast and raising awareness around these important issues, dear Mustafa.
And thank you for all listening. See you in the next episode of Human and AI Philosophical Reflections.